Hello, and welcome here to Radical Engagements at Barnblog. And today we're covering friend of the show, Daniel Tutt's exploration of the ego ideal in Christopher Lasch and his piece for Substack called Use Your Illusion. I find classical psychoanalysis to be an interesting proto-science, which is not to diminish it, not to say that there's nothing useful about it. There's tons of useful things about psychoanalysis. It's hard to call it scientific by today's standards, but it's also probably too easy and too many people have for too long just dismissed it entirely. Nonetheless, Daniel Tutt and I probably don't entirely agree on the usefulness of psychoanalysis. And in fact, one of my big concerns and criticisms of Christopher Lasch has to do with the shift from his early historiography to his Marxio-Freudianism. Although I do think there is a lot of merit to what he was attempting to do on the basis of primary and secondary narcissism and understanding the difference between Fordism and what would come to be called neoliberalism. Now, I gave a paper on this at the Society for Intellectual History conference in Denver in 2023, which will be revised into a chapter in my Lasch book once I get to writing it. I've been talking about my co-author Shalom Bentine's dissertation for a while, and now I'm writing another book. So I'll come back to Lasch. I have to go to his archives in Rochester to find some things anyway. Nonetheless, I want to talk about this piece here. And this also references an interview that I was a co-interviewee with Daniel on his show, Emancipations, with Gabriel Rayburn on the work of Eugene Genovese. So, and the weird agrarian Southern history that gets tied up into that. So there's a lot here, and I have a stake in it. So just take that as it may. Let's get into the piece. All right, let's make this bigger for you. Use Your Illusion on the concept of the ego ideal for Christopher Lasch. And we begin with a Guns N' Roses song from the second CD I owned as a kid, Guns N' Roses Use Your Illusion 2, which I got before Use Your Illusion 1 for some reason. This is totally unrelated and personal. Let's get back on track here. You want to step into my world. It's a social psychotic state of bliss. You've been delayed in the real world. How many times have you hit and missed? Guns N' Roses, My World from Use Your Illusion 2. The relevance of Christopher Lasch's critique of the left. Mention of Christopher Lasch's critique of the left may very well be triggering to some. I mean, I don't know why critiques are triggering, but that's just me. I remember participating in a panel on family abolition at the American Psychoanalytic Association, the first panel ever dedicated to the topic at the APA. And in my remarks, I invoke Lasch's critique of the family, or the critique of family abolition. My co-panelists later expressed a strong emotional response to the application of Lasch because they read Lasch as explicitly a red-brown thinker. In what sense is he red-brown? You might call Lasch an anti-feminist, rightly, depending on the time period that you're talking about Lasch. Early Lasch is much more impressed with radical feminists and much less impressed with liberal ones. And this is very clear in his first 4 books. But his favorite, he spoke highly of the Black Power movement and was very fond of Martin Luther King, even in his late period. It's hard to call him red-brown in that sense. maybe in the sense that you think he's a reactionary thinker on the family, but that probably has to do with his literal take on classical Freudianism. And even there, I disagree with some scholars that I've cited in my own work that talk about him as abandoning Marx for Freud, where it's a little bit more complicated than that. He was neither as enamored with Marxism by the 70s as one might would have liked, but he never fully abandoned it entirely either. And in his late life, he was a big fan of Sorel, which maybe is the only thing you can really say is a Red Brown inclination in the man. Um, but even his Sorelianism was more about the need for ideal types and uh, myths almost. Anyway, and really, we don't know much about his admiration for Sorel because it really only comes up in one interview in Telios magazine in the early 1990s, right before he died of cancer. Right. In other words, they read Lasch as Sophie Lewis suggests in her recent manifesto, Abolish the Family, where she says Lasch's thoughts offer support for the anti-feminist defenses of the patriarchy, where Sophie Lewis is basically parroting Susan Faludi and Backlash, a book I have right over there, partly for this reason. But Lewis then goes on to quote Nina Powers in her work, What Do Men Want?, as if Powers is definitive proof that Lasch is destined to be co-opted by reactionaries. Well, he was co-opted by reactionaries. I don't think destined or not is sort of irrelevant. But is that the only way to lose Lasch? No. Lash's biographer very much seems to be a Christian. The paleo conservatives and Roger Kimball over there at the New Criterion was fond of Lasch. But unlike Eugene Genovese, Lasch never has a breaking moment. He never endorses anything explicitly reactionary at all. He does try to conjure up a working class traditionalism as an answer to conservative, what he saw pseudo traditionalism in the Reagan era. And to Kuhn, and he abandons that for a kind of neo-populism that was not particularly right-wing, although elements of it in The Revolt of the Elites could be read that way. But I'm a defender of Lasch. Take it as you may. I don't think Lasch's critique of feminism should be completely abandoned, but I also think he does mischaracterize many feminists that he's engaging with. In his engagement in Cocoon magazine in 1988, I believe, which is usually the essay that is cited when he leaves the left. Lillian Rubin and him just seem to be talking past each other, and actually they agree on more than they even let on. And Lasch's response to Rubin sometimes they're not as substantive. I covered this on the channel 2 years ago on an episode you can find on the YouTube with Jules Asele. Anyway, Lasch's critique of the left is not born from unfamiliarity with the radical left. No. Nor is it waged on cheap right-wing opportunism. No, it isn't. I would totally agree there. I would probably argue more needs to be expanded on that because I went through a lot of Lasch's work to check and see, and there are things that we would read as right-wing today. His opinions on homosexuality are classically Freudian and thus would strike everyone as homophobic, although they were common even on the Frankfurt School left at the time. But nonetheless, as I have argued in this interview, any assessment of Lasch that has to begin with his writings in the 1950s, which include his dissertation on American liberals' reaction to Bolshevism and the events of 1917. Absolutely. A book that I didn't initially think was important, but began to think was very important when I read it. As sort of a beginning of the first 4 books of Lasch, which I kind of see as his historical period and his historicization of the American left and its class origins, in different groups. These books include Agony of the American Left, World of Nations, uh, The Intellectual, New Radicals, and his history of liberals' response to the Bolshevism, which is a interesting book and one that taught me stuff about John Dewey, who I was already not inclined to dislike even more. All right. He went on to pen a series of works that begins with Last Odyssey and Understanding Transformations of the American Left in the mid-20th century, The Agony of the American Left, World of Nations, and eventually to the polemical work called Haven in a Heartless World, a book on the family. All these works must be assessed before anyone accuses Lasch of some sort of inevitable conservatism. Absolutely. And they are each relevant touchstones point for understanding a thinker who is best understood not as an enemy to the left, but as a deeply honest and critical interlocutor. Absolutely. With Barbara Ehrenreich and others, Lasch was a similar figure in seeking to launch a Socialist Party in America. This project fizzled out in the wake of the 1968 DNC convention and turned to a much darker, more nihilistic sort of politics on the left. He was also a critique of left populism and Michael Harrington post-68 after that as well. I'm just going to add that in there because his critique of Harrington is particularly prescient in the last couple of years. After the tumultuous events of 1968 and the chaotic state that the left found itself in, incapable of waging any serious electoral threat to capitalist parties and turning to an increasingly violent and subterranean politics, Lasch began a systemic Frankfurt School method of research. This began his mature period, which consists of the substantive critique of American culture, by which he came to be known by the culture of narcissism. I would add that it's a critique of American culture in Fordism and its ending, and you need to read The Minimal Self, the sequel to it, to really understand all of it. But that's just me. And I know Tutt agrees with me on this. But importantly, as I mentioned, Lasch had already made his mark as a critic of the American left. And even after 1968, he remained a committed Marxist scholar. Lasch never renounces Marxism throughout this period, all the while bringing his Freudian and Marxist critique of society in the 1970s. Nope. He only says a few critical words about some insufficiencies of Marxism in the 80s, but he doesn't even renounce it then. He gets annoyed with Marxist in his discussions in Tikkun magazine in the late 80s because he sees them as bringing the working class for their own problems, a trend that he sees going all the way back to Adorno and the Frankfurt School. And we'll come back to that. As Gabriel Rayburn has noted in his incredible essay on the efforts of Lasch and Eugene Genovese, a firebrand Marxist historian who, unlike Lasch, did become a conservative, really firebrandy one too, to launch a Marxist academic journal called Marxist Perspectives in the 1970s. Like the effort to start a socialist party, the project imploded due to infighting between the ideological rivalry that Lasch had with the New Left. Lasch's more critical perspective itself cannot be pigeonholed as the old left because he certainly stakes out a number of critiques of that tendency in his early works. I mean, both Marxist and non-Marxist old left get hit on by Lasch. He doesn't talk much about the Bolsheviks outside of the American response to the Bolsheviks because he was an American cultural historian by training. And he doesn't really touch on the Bolsheviks, but even in his late work, as late as The True and Only Heaven, a critique of, the idea of progress, he was talking about the need for détente with the Soviet Union and the avoidance of the Cold War. So he never renounced that either. It's not something a conservative in the 80s would have done. All right. The project to bring about a critical Marxist journal fell apart due to a single article that Lasch wrote on the critique of militant feminism entitled The Flight from Feelings. As context, the counterculture had grown obscure and disconnected from mass politics. We had a hyperbolic and over-the-top movements such as the Scum Manifesto, just to give you a feel for the sort of feminist politics that were in vogue on the radical left at the time. Yeah, that's important to remember. This is the beginning of separatist lesbianism as a political answer, for example. Lasch's article takes a political position on radical feminism, arguing that in practice, most of it foments and accelerates division between the sexes, and that it moves away from class analysis on the origins of resentments between men and women in the household. Yes, although I would say Lasch wasn't always great of a reader of Engels on those problems of social reproduction. But I don't want to over condemn him on this either. I think Lasch has to be seen as a mixed figure here, but because he does actually, in general, think that women and women's issues need to be more important to the left, but that feminism had largely been used as a cover. This is what he kind of says in both Haven indirectly, and he actually kind of directly says it. Even as early as World of Nations, that and he definitely directly says it in the Tikkun Olam and the Tikkun magazine pieces from the 1980s, that feminism was used to get women to work, and it was used to hide the fact that the family wage was dismantled, as well as and he says the family wage was always insufficient. He wasn't idealizing the family wage. As well as a few other things. He does turn out against no-fault divorce, a position that was also shared by the National Women's Organization, even though it was not a great idea. As we now know, the end of no-fault divorce is strongly correlated with, the beginning of no-fault divorce, not the end, of no-fault divorce is strongly motivated with the decrease in spousal murder. So probably a good thing. Anyway, at the core, Lasch's flight from feelings article suggests that his personal relations are becoming increasingly risky due to economic fragility, overwork, and instability. But the effect of much of this discourse of radical feminism is to induce an irrational raise in hatred across the sexes, especially when it demands placed on men and women alike are not met. Lasch argues that a lot of militant feminism is bad up with a progressive ideology that ends up making a virtue of emotional disengagement and leads to the depersonalization of sex. He argues most directly and controversially that the new discourse on radical feminism does not permit women who may not subscribe to his doctrine to, quote, no longer be able to retreat from the safety of discredited conventions. In other words, the radical left was shaping new norms of sex, which were preventing the very sort of liberation they purported to practice and lived in manner inside the household. The article has a stinging political bite, as political pieces do, and it certainly provokes in the reader a sense that Lasch is not sensitive to the standpoint of feminist liberation. Yeah, I would agree with that. Although he was schooled in feminist historiography, he did read them and knew it pretty well. But I would tell people to read the Susan Faludi critique of Lasch. Whether you agree with it or not, you need to sit with it for a little while. And in fact, the article was so polemical that it caused a leadership crisis within Marxist perspective journals, which led to its eventual crash. That wasn't the first time this had happened, by the way. Lasch had other issues with groups over some of these issues around feminism and the family. Genovese loved the article and thought that Lasch should proceed with it regardless of its critics, and it was in that specific instance by Genovese, a longstanding critic of the New Left and its turn to identity politics. Although he was a critic of a New Left, but he was a fan of Italian Eurocommunism. And when Eurocommunism failed, he started getting into like Southern agrarian romanticism and eventually neoconservatism. Genovese, not Lasch. So while he was a longstanding critic of the New Left, he was also kind of a supporter of the European version of it. It's a little hard to parse. All right. That led to the collapse of the journal. But I read Lasch as a more cooperative with the radical left than Genovese. Definitely by the 1980s he was. And he was willing to revise the article to meet the expectations of dissenting feminist voices within the journal. But Genovese would have none of it and ended up lashing out on Lasch, calling him a coward. Yep, he did do that. The ego ideal, ideology, illusion, and desire. This background should give you a glimpse into the complexity that Lasch faced in his engagement with the radical left, an engagement that was deep and consistent over the entirety of his life. although he was more and more frustrated by the end of his life. There's no denying that. But I want to now turn to a particular conceptual approach that Lasch adopts in the Freudian field that I believe deeply informs his critique of the left, as well as his imminent analysis of the crisis that faces the left in the post-68 milieu. Lasch was deeply influenced by the psychoanalyst Janine Sugier-Smergel, I think, a thinker who argued that the ego idea stands as one of Freud's most important concepts. From her analysis of the ego ideal, Smergel, along with Lasch, developed a particular understanding of the logic of narcissism in contemporary culture. And based on this analysis, they understand the radical left, its demands, and its conceptions of liberation based on the logic of the ego ideal. And this is really discussed in the book, The Minimal Self. This is where Smergel really comes up the most. I'm just adding this because I wrote a paper on this recently. And it's interesting because Smergel's also famous for getting into a fight with Lacan, where Lacan implies that she is basically an authoritarian. And another thing that differs Lacanian psychoanalysis, a psychoanalysis that I'm also pretty critical of, I've even strongly implied multiple times that it might be crypto-Catholic, is nonetheless interesting in that what many people in classical Freudianism take as literal dynamics of sexual relations, like a literal male and literal female and literal sex, Lacan doesn't go off at the, collective consciousness deep end of Jung or anything like that, but he does see a lot of this as more metaphorical, and you could talk about female men and whatnot in Lacan. Still probably would make people deeply uncomfortable by today's gender standards, but nonetheless. All right. Once we grasp the concept of the ego ideal, we can begin to weigh its value and its strength as a concept for thinking, politics, and liberation. Freud first introduced the concept of the ego ideal in his 1914 essay on narcissism, where he defined it as an infantile illusion of omnipotence. In narcissism, the subject identifies with the ego ideal, and Freud says that narcissism is not a perversion, but the libidinal complement to the egoism of the instinct of self-preservation, a measure which may be justifiably be attributed to every creature. The ego idea is thus what Freud calls the target of self-love, which was enjoyed in childhood by the actual ego. The subject's narcissism makes its appearance as a displacement onto a new ego, ideal ego, which, like an infantile ego, finds itself possessed of every perfection that is of value. Freud says that man is incapable of giving up a satisfaction that is once enjoyed, a truth of the libido, and thus man is not willing to forgo the narcissistic perfection of his childhood. Quote from Freud. And when, as he grows up, he is disturbed by the admonitions of others and by the awakening of his own critical judgment, so that he can no longer retain that perfection, he seeks to recover in this new form of the ego ideal. What he projects before him as ideal is a substitute for the lost narcissism of his childhood, in which he has lost his own ideal. The ego ideal is thus a constant and repeating source of nostalgia in our lives. It is an irrational desire for attaining an unattainable lost perfection. At an early age, it governs the translation of our bodily needs into the register of desire. The ego ideal does not obey the death instinct according to Freud, but rather obeys a narcissistic impulse. And since we are unlike animals and do not have sexual periods where we are active and then inactive, our sexual impulse is constant. It is constant, although it's not constant of the same intensity. Some of our animal instincts still rearing its head there. The sexual drive only heightens this narcissistic longing in which the ego ideal is based. Okay. The ego ideal is irrational. It does not know death, and it is bound up with the nirvana principle. As this principle is indifferent to bodily demands, it exceeds absolute release from tension. The only process by which this irrationality of the ego ideal can be mediated and thus brought under control is maturation and development, the process of overcoming the paternal attachments, the Oedipus complex, and thus comes to the fundamentally butt heads with the ego ideal. The ego ideal is conditioned by the social dynamics shaped by social norms and prohibitions. Absolutely. In the culture of narcissism, Lasch argues that the American culture has depleted the ego ideal, and he diagnoses this as stemming from changes to the family, the rise of bureaucracy over everyday life, consumerism, the rise of therapeutic ideologies, and the attendant psychic woes that this has brought about, from increasing sense of hollowness in the interior life to the authority that is often cruel, unhinged, and imposing no limits. At first, at issue for Lasch is the dialectic of the ego ideal, with the process of maturation and working through barriers. This has broken down in contemporary life, and this breakdown is encapsulated when Lasch says the primary narcissism of the imperial self is pushed into the dark, empty corner that because they lack an ego ideal. An important point to note here is that the ego ideal is abandoned by Freud in 1924. As he turns to the elaborate death drive and the superego, concepts will take a back seat. Yeah, so Lasch actually likes earlier Freud versus later Freud, and so does Smergel, which is where he gets this from. But Lasch finds a more dialectical concept that the death drive, because it ties an account of the subjective tension mediated within the social field. Its logic is both internal and external. By dialectical, we mean the logic of the ego ideal and its irrationality must mediate and thus compromise with the reality principle. It must interact with the process of overcoming the illusion of the pure blissful illusion, the nirvana principle, that is not going to occur in a non-antagonistic manner. This inevitably results in frustration and aggression, and in society that no longer enforces maturation or possesses a clear initiatory means by which the subject undergoes the process of maturation, the ego ideal is embraced as an irrational and thus only compounds a particular form of unmediated narcissism. Secondary narcissism in the case of Fordism, primary narcissism in the case of neoliberalism, are the beginnings of neoliberalism as made clear in the minimal self. I'm just adding that to Tutt here, but Tutt's right. I think he's completely interpreting what Lasch means, and Tutt knows more about Freud than me. I definitely defer to him on this. I would just say that Lasch actually does see primary narcissism and secondary narcissism as related to different phases of literal political economy in the United States. That Lasch does think there's a political economic reason in addition to the social reasons above, because he can't separate out, and he wouldn't try to separate out the social, the cultural, and the economic. He is not one of these people who relies on the base superstructure metaphor very much. Anyway, importantly, the ego ideal has a personal narcissistic quality as it is located in the unattainable childhood illusions. The ego ideal marks for us, for life, with the irrational desire to be born outside of limits. This is a lesson for aesthetics and artistic production as much as it is for politics, given that the artist is tapping into the same yearning as the political militant. Yes, they are, but in entirely different ways, which is also why Plato wanted to kick the poets out of the Republic. But anyway, both are aiming to recapture a fusion with a one to which they long ago displaced and substituted for other objects. We forget the ways that this displacement and substitution works, but we should remember that it is a constant process, a life's work that does not cease. This is the merit of the concept. It becomes a political ethical concept of the first order. I would agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. This is indeed an ethical task that we must set ourselves out with the knowledge into the ego ideal, namely how to avoid frustration and aggression that comes from the inevitable loss of omnipotence and wholeness. Politics, art, and love are about the acceptance of limits, imperfections, flaws, and lack. A politics that refuses limits and an imperfection is one bent on maintaining narcissistic illusions, and this is what Smergel refers to as perversion. Perversion theorizes an attempt to overcome anxiety and pain of separation by annulling any knowledge of the obstacles to which the reunion of the mother and child. Perversion denies the existence of obstacles and limits, and the pervert refuses the procedures involved with maturing, which necessitate limits. The pervert will not accept ordinary unhappiness and instead throws himself in extraordinary unhappiness. That's the Freudian analysis of almost all schools of Freudianism in simple terms. Freudian Marxism, and the particular invariants that follow William Reich, according to Smergel, only heighten a leftist desire which wants to preserve the infantile illusion of omnipotence. This has the practical effect of making the left advocate for antisocial bonds based on collective illusion, not based on leadership or limits. For Herman Marcuse and Norman O'Brown, two Orthodox Protestant Freudian Marxists, of whom Lasch wrote a lot about, I'm just adding that, the demands of politics revolve around the claims that civilization depends on the regimen and order that it is not able to free eros. But Freudian Marxism, precisely by conceiving of liberation in such a total way as a freeing of all chains, only compounds the irrationality of the ego ideal, which contributes to a loop of frustration on the left. It's aimed to bring about a world where all needs are satisfied, where a world of harmony will finally reign, where contented humanity will dream no more. The left develops a social bond within this when each subject is promised a reunion with their ego ideal, but yet this illusion is one of personal omnipotence. When this illusion does not occur, which, as we experienced in 1968, or in 2012, or in 2016, or in 2020, this result it's in persecution, censorship, scapegoating, and exaggerating blame game, in which the left abuse a sense of omnipotence and exonerates oneself as beyond critique. I don't know. If you don't see this in today's left, I don't know where the fuck you are. I definitely agree that this is a tendency on the left and has been actually way before even Freud. But nonetheless, a new utopian socialism is formed in response to the failure of the left to realize its demands. The spirit of 68 wanes. The ego ideal in bourgeois groups. Let's carefully pick apart the merits of this critique of the left and the concept of the politics of illusion on which it's based. And I think there's a lot to talk about the politics of illusion, but in a way that you really can't take this in a conservative way, which Lacan kind of accuses Smergel of doing. I'm actually interested that Daniel doesn't talk more about that debate here. But anyway, Lasch doesn't talk about it at all. Lasch mentions Lacan once in a footnote in the Minimal Self, I believe in the Minimal Self, and that's it. And he has an extensive knowledge of Freudianism, but Lacan doesn't come up much. All right. A community based on the ideology, the illusion that is made synonymous with the ideology for Smergel and Lasch, has no dose of reality. They have organized around an individualist promise that mires each subject in primary narcissism, promising each member that they can find a solution to restoring the ego ideal. Yes. And that's what he gets to in the Minimal Self book, and it's clearly articulated there. It's in Culture of Narcissism, but barely. All right. I want to argue that ultimately Smergel and Lasch develop a condition of a group bond based on an illusion that is confusing. Okay. Let me attempt now to provide a revamped application of their concept of the left by revisiting how Freud theorizes the bond of the revolutionary group and group psychology in the analysis of the ego. And this is where I get into people like Bion, and who I'm reading more slowly and carefully these days as an answer, because I find Freud's answer to be a little underdeveloped. All right. For starters, we have to understand that it is in this artificial group, church, army, corporation, as Leon Roseitzner suggests, we should refer to them as bourgeois groups. The social being of each member remains essentially eternally in place. The function of the group is to serve as the subjective support for the invariable permanence of the system, institutions, and power arrangements of bourgeois society. Thus, in the bourgeois group, synonymous with the artificial group, each subject preserves an identical dependency that the self-enclosed adult maintains in the preservation of his or her infantile sensibility. Artificial groups fall apart. They forfeit this bond that allow each subject to access their own ego ideal illusion. What happens when they fail to preserve relations and each member can effectively satiate their own ego ideals? This breakdown calls for a periodization in the very process. Periodizations of stabilization are marked by bourgeois institutions stabilizing ego ideals, and breakdowns are marked by inconsistency in this process. We are now at a more precise point to understand how the radical left enters the picture. I want to argue that the radical left emerges as a primary mediator of the breakdown in the ego ideal dispensation within bourgeois groups and institutions. This is different from Lasch. All right. What the post-May 68 left points to is a grand counter-revolution in which the logic of revolt and rebellion is posed, an entire repertoire of demands aimed at the total obliteration of defective and repressive bourgeois ideas is waged, but the basis of this assault was absorbed by the bourgeois institutions. And I'm just going to say, in normal person, non-psychoanalytic language, we call this radical chic, and abso-fucking-lutely. Read The Rebel Cell by Joseph Heap, and who else? I can't remember who was the other author of that. Read anything about the commodification of dissent. The counterculture leftist demands are, as Smergel points out, fundamentally perverse in the structure as they deny the existence of obstacles and limits, even when they claim to be about limits. I'm just going to add that. The pervert refuses castration, and they form a rebellion based on the immediacy of demands for omnipotence in union with the ego ideal. What they just fail to do is construct an ideal that would enable a different relay system for the entire repressive bourgeois ideals, or return to the idiosyncratic narcissism of the ego ideals of the subject. So are they projections of the individual, or are they reestablishments of bourgeois social orders co-opting them? I'm translating this into normie speak. Remember, I'm more skeptical of psychoanalysis than Tutt, but I think this is a good reading of what classical psychoanalysis would probably indicate. Anyway, in this reading, a post-68 leftism gave birth to a new solution to the narcissistic capitalist pursuit of the personal ego ideals, as it offered up a new conception of politics, one which revolves around the claim that, as we now see in Marcuse, for example, if civilization depends on the regimentation and order, it is not able to free eros. A left that directs its activity towards the freeing of eros still, of course, leaves each rebellious subject in abeyance from any real achievements of pleasure, because it has not offered a solution to the practical problems of limits of initiation of the reality principle itself. Not to make fun of polyamorous people, because I find that to be a reactionary trope these days, but there are limits to the size of your polycule and its functioning. All right. It promises only an ephemeral release, a temporal catharsis that will inevitably lead to a frustrating letic politics, one that is ultimately still reliant on bourgeois institutions. We live in a time in which bourgeois institutions are capable of hollowing out their repressive ideals, their repressive apparatuses, power, or you want to use what the post-liberals say, oh gods, do whatever you want to put there, and swapping them out in a newly enacted letic ones, all while maintaining the relations of labor dependence on the subject. This transvaluation, a classical left Nietzschean counter-revolutionary gesture, is better for the maintenance of bourgeois groups. Tutt does have to get his anti-Nietzsche thing in there. I'm not even saying it's wrong. I just got to get it in there in a place that it only barely seems to fit. But anyway, it does fit barely. We are talking about as a new terrain, a new dialectic between the radical left and bourgeois groups, one in which the left compensates for the deficiencies of bourgeois groups fair to mediate their edical ideals of its subjects. AKA, to use normie terms, it is a pressure release valve that you are already figured into the equation of the bourgeois subjectivity by your participation in anti-bourgeois politics in these normative ways. Yay. All right, back to Tutt. The argument that Lasch and Smergel are making thus be received by the left as somewhat constructive criticism. It suggests that the left ends up fulfilling the lack of ideas within bourgeois groups. This is a process I refer to the paradox of liberation in my book on family, a book that I have around here somewhere. I have both of Daniel's books. I like his book on the family, believe it or not, quite a bit. All right, the left after the breakdown of the spirit of 68. The premise of this dialectic between the left and bourgeois groups relies on reading the new spirit of capitalism, and we can periodize the system as follows. And we have a diagram here. I don't want to try to do the diagram for the visually impaired and or those who are just listening. Periodization of Marxist modern spirit of capitalism. 19th century, 1920s to 60s, 1960s to 2000s, 2000s to present. 19th century, classical spirit based on rational calculation, liberal utilitarian reasons. 1930s and World War II. Although I would say at the end of this, if you listen to Lenin, you have the emergence of both monopoly capital and pressures on the state, and thus interstate competition leading to imperialism. That's the Lenin story. That's not in Boltanski and Chiapello's The New Spirit of Capitalism, but it is sort of there. 1920s and 1960s, faith and rationality, long-term planning, bureaucratic rationality, the age of the managers, Fordism, Keynesian social democracy, etc. That's the high point of theirs. We talk about this as the pre and post-war consensuses. In the 1920s, you see the beginnings of faith and rationality, but after the war, you really see a bloom. 1968 to the 2000s, the spirit of 68, widespread disenchantment. We no longer merely to live, but to live for a reason. And then 2000s to present, breakdown of the spirit of 68, symbolic misery. And I think these roughly, but don't entirely correspond to what we might call periodizations of developments of capital. So classical 19th century capitalism, or you can call it Robert Bellarmine capitalism, or titans of industry capitalism if you're a loser conservative. The shift to monopoly capital, the shift to Fordism, the shift out of Fordism to neoliberalism, and the shift out of neoliberalism from its decline, starting in the dot-com bubble, fully instantiated in 2007, and then in this weird, not really dead, but kind of post-neoliberal, but not quite hazy world that we live in today, which does have the spirit of symbolic misery all over it, we see roughly corresponding to this chart from the modern spirit of capitalism. All right. The breakdown period is precisely where the left provided new ideals, new solutions to the ego ideal in the wake of the failure of bourgeois institutions. The left here is the mediator of successful ideas that are in the loop of the near immediate and constant co-optation and reintegration. Note, in this timeline, I was incorporating Bernard Stiegler's elaborations on neo-Weberian theory and symbolic misery series. I think that's interesting, and it's interesting for Daniel to do that. I think maybe explaining this in terms of the ego ideal is a little too much, but I don't know. I'm willing to entertain it. Let's continue. We have to remember that the ego ideal is socially mediated, and being socially mediated is also materially mediated. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. This is why the group is so essential in the maintenance of the ego ideal for the subject. There's a two-pronged struggle. The subject refuses socially imposed ego ideals, i.e. the normative imposition of the ego ideal, such as market demands, austerity, frugality, competition, for example, inevitably become the site of rivalry in which the subject's core aim is to recover lost satisfaction, and it will begrudgingly accept substitutions to its lost core. But there is nothing like touching the pure core of lost satisfaction. There is nothing equivalent to the libidinal charge at stake of fulfilling what the reunification promises. And what it promises is a blissful submersion into the oneness of nature, into the oneness of the universe. And it's here where Lacan will enter the story with a radically alternate version of this desire for submersion into a blissful one. I was waiting for Lacan to enter. Knew Daniel was going to bring Lacan into this, and Lasch doesn't. And I do think he does need to mention more about the Smergel-Lacan debates, but that's neither here nor there. It's worth noting how different Lacan's concept of narcissism is from this account. He maintains a stark opposite position from this claim. Lacan argues that blissful submersion into the motherly one only foments greater aggressivity in the subject. Quote, the individual is most him or herself in the wondrous emptiness of being, rather than the personal ego or the other utter totality, as Rule Moncao remarks in The Emptiness of Oedipus. I discussed this contrast between Lacan and Smergel in a recent presentation with my study group on Lacan Seminar 16, from the other to the other. So, okay. He does discuss it, just not in this essay. I'll give Daniel credit for that. All right. There are clear merits to Smergel and Lasch's claim that ideology can be understood via the ego idea, i.e. as a promise of shelter for the restoration of the personal ego ideal as experienced in childhood. What this means is that ideology promises an all too easy reunification with the personal ego ideas, and by this metric, we can judge the effectiveness of an ideology based on the degree in which it satiates the longing for a return of its subject to the personal ego ideal identifications. The parasocial dynamics on the left today, driven by online subcommunities that are ultimately no longer about mother fusion as its object, as we witness in the Spirit of 68, bourgeois institutions have placated and absorbed the ludic basis of leftist ideology to such an extent that we see emerge now a demand for communities organized around the demand for the father, wherein the goal of the leader is not to permit motherly bliss and reunion, but to foster rational independence, responsibility, and to accept limits. Daniel, I want more. Seriously, though, I want more. I feel like you really pushed us there, and then you don't really stay with it there for a second. I know you're going to listen to this, and I don't have much critique other than the few things that I said, but I want you to push more on this Lacan Smergel Lasch distinction because I think it is actually interesting. You know me, we've discussed psychoanalysis before, and this is for the audience, but this is the one time I'm going to directly address the author because I know the author is going to listen because I'm going to send it to him. So I want more of this. I want this explored more. Where's this tension at? I want to thank you, Daniel, for writing this and getting us back in the interest of Lasch and pointing to the beginnings of a necessary critique of Lasch that is not just dismissing him. I have my own, and a lot of my stuff around him and the family is acknowledging there are conservativist elements in there, but there's also counter elements in Lasch. And that Lasch's ideas about the family are, he says some things in the 88 piece that I mentioned about anthropology that are just wrong. But he never, mainly because he seems to have stopped reading anthropology in the 1960s. But he was familiar with it up to then. I don't think Lasch's a figure that our Freud or even Lacan, I'm not even sure I consider Lacan a totally leftist figure himself. In fact, I'm pretty sure I don't. That doesn't mean that I think we should throw him out either or throw psychoanalysis out for whatever limitations I think it may have. This framework is really helpful to be getting us to see the overlaps between political economy and these different ideas of understanding psychic nature. And we have to deal with that, particularly today when with internal self and external self, when id and ego, to use Freudian terms, are when character, mask, and personal subject, to use more classical, truly classical terms, are conflated and hollowed out and pushed into the world without its embodiedness. And I think this critique begins to get us to look at that and then look at the way the left has been part and a contributor to this while also being subject to it. And that in some ways the left response to capital is almost an autoimmune response. Almost from capital itself, if such a thing can be said to be a thing. And remember, these are all metaphors that I'm spitballing here. In no way is it actually an autoimmune response, and in no way is capitalism actually one thing. But then again, it is a system, and no system is one thing. Systems are emergent and understood in their relationality, in their emergent relationality, in the way that the definitions and social world co-define them. They aren't like physical objects in that way, although they do contain them and do conceptualize them. Anyway, check out Daniel's podcast and Substack. I think this is very much worth engaging with. Daniel has been a good interlocutor and for me on a variety of subjects. He got me to take Domenico Lacerda more seriously for good and ill. He's gotten me to go a little bit deeper in my understanding of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is still probably my favorite reactionary, but I've always thought he was a reactionary. Doesn't mean there isn't some truth to it. Uh, I think this will get people to think more about where Lacan and Smergel really go in different ways in classical psychoanalysis and what its implications are for politics, because it does have them. Thank you. Like and subscribe. Follow Daniel's work. He supports me directly. So, that he subscribes to my show. So, like, I really know he's going to hear this. And I subscribe to his. So follow us both, like and subscribe. You'll find Daniel's Substack in the show notes with this article linked. And come back here for more Lasch stuff, because I still want to talk about Lasch. I'm even though I've taken a little bit of break on that book, after spending 3 years reading every scrap of material I could on the man, and like going in and checking people's reference notes against each other, and reading Lasch's early drafts of articles that became chapters in Culture of Narcissism that were actually published beforehand, and the New York Review of Books, but in a slightly different form. Blah 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 blah. I can't say that I can't talk about him all day, because I can. I've devoted a lot of my life to understanding the man, not as much as to Marx or even to Adorno or Nietzsche, but a ton. Particularly in the last 5 years. So, if you want more Lasch, like and subscribe. Protect your peace. Figure out how to deal with your ego ideal. And I kind of like that Lasch doesn't like the death drive, because the death drive always kind of seemed to me as a description of something, not an explanation of something, and thus kind of a cop-out. But that's my hot take on Freud. I have others, but including stuff about his actual record keeping practices and clinical practices, but that's neither here nor there. All right. You can subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon. Follow Daniel, follow Daniel's work. You can find his Patreon too. And have a great day and deal with your ego ideal.